Good morning, everyone. So I am the second Californian that's speaking in a row here, but unlike Nick, for me, it's a bit of a homecoming. So I was born in Sydney, and I have not been back for 30 years, so yesterday was my first day back. So it's really exciting to actually come back and see the just the energy around startups and around growth in Sydney. It's inspiring and something probably a lot of the rest of the world misses because you guys are pretty far away. So a little bit of context on my background. I spent the first 10 years of my career working in a couple of companies that from basically customer zero through IPO filings on NASDAQ. And through these two companies, I learned that in the later years, pretty much all of the execution that we were doing was based on things that we figured out in the early years. And so getting the early years right, the traction years right, instrumenting the analytics, figuring out who the heck needs the product in the first place and why they need it and how they use it, and all of those things are really critical for long-term being able to grow a business. And the challenge is that if you're successful, like Nick, that you kind of go through that upfront stage and then you are done with it. And in my case, I had 4 years of sort of executing on that foundation twice. And so what I missed was really experience in that upfront area. And so for the next few years, I worked at companies like Dropbox and Eventbrite and Lookout, where I was the first marketer going in and really being able to learn the cycles of what matters and when does it matter, and what are the similarities between companies and what's completely unique, and is there some sort of systematic way you can bring a company to market. And I figured out a lot of stuff, and I'll share some of that in a minute. But then, most recently, I kind of took all of that learning and then applied it to my own company and starting a company that has kind of gone through some of the twists and turns that a lot of startups do, and getting to that point where you can ultimately make the business really growable. But I'll be sharing a lot of the lessons that I've learned through that and through these other companies, and ultimately, hopefully, it's something that will apply back to each of you in terms of whatever stage you're at. If you're in the scale stage or you're in the early traction stage, some of those lessons hopefully will be very relevant to you. So the big takeaway that I had from all of the experiences is that growth really comes in stages. And if you fail at the first stage, you're going to probably fail at the second stage, and you'll probably fail at the third stage. So you have to get the first stage right, which is product market fit, before you can start to lay a foundation of really stacking the odds for being able to grow the business. And once you do those things, then you can start to scale the business. And so most of what I'll talk about today is around scaling growth, but I wanted to start with some of the foundational pieces that are really critical. So product market fit is something that I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about, but it can be a little bit confusing. So for me, just at its simplest form, it's about creating a must-have product for a market that's big enough to be able to scale a business into. And the way that I figure out if it's a must-have product is actually just ask people. And so I know that I have something that's scalable when enough people who I ask, when I say, how would you feel if you couldn't use the product anymore, if they tell me they'd be very disappointed, that's a really good sign. That means we've created something of value for them. But if they say they'd be somewhat disappointed, that's a nice to have product. If they say they wouldn't be disappointed, or they don't even use it anymore, that's a really bad sign. And so what I found is that if 40% or more of the people who you ask that question to say they'd be very disappointed without the product, then you have a good fighting chance of being able to grow that business. Of course, that's just a predictive metric. The reality is, if they say this and then they stop using the product, then that's probably even more important than their answer to that question. But most people who say they'd be very disappointed without the product continue to use the product. So assuming that you have product market fit, then the next stage that you need to focus on is the stage that I call stacking the odds for growth. And stacking the odds for growth really boils down to figuring out who are those people who can't live without your product. Learning everything you can about those people. Why did they sign up for your product in the first place? Why do they keep using it? What's the key benefit that they're getting? Why is that benefit actually important to them? How are they using the product? When they start using it, what do they do first? And what's the difference between the people who don't care that much about the product? And so when you start to find the signal of the product being a must-have for those people, if you can really learn everything you can about those people, then you have the formula to try to repeat on future people. So that's really what the next piece is really about, figuring out that value delivery machine that you learned on that first group and applying it to another group of people. So setting a relevant but powerful promise. A lot of people get so caught up in A/B testing these days that they ultimately end up creating a promise that's totally inauthentic to what the product can actually do, because it tested best on an A/B test and got people kind of to the next step, where ultimately if the promise that you put out there is one that is based on what people love about the product, then the people who convert on that promise are actually going to be really happy when they go in and use the product and realize that it is capable of delivering on that. So strong, powerful promises, really important. And then streamlining the delivery of that must-have experience, getting as many people into that must-have experience as possible, having them get to that point where they get all of the benefit of the product as quickly as possible. They're much more likely to stay stuck into the product and not churn out in a short period of time. So once you have that value delivery engine, once you have the value in the first place, now you're ready to scale a business. And then you can focus on actually doing the things that lead to long-term growth. And we'll be focusing on that for the rest of the talk here. So the one thing to start with is that scaling, even with all those things, it's not easy. It's actually really hard, and it's getting harder. And so this is a graphic that James Currier, really successful marketer in Silicon Valley, put together, where it's just sort of the life cycle of channels. And just when you figure out a channel, it stops working. And even a channel, so something like MySpace disappears completely, but Facebook, the things you did a year ago in Facebook that worked, don't work anymore. And you need to figure out the new things that work in Facebook. So with changing algorithms, you need to keep adjusting to those. So that's the shelf life of a channel is really short now, so you got to get in there quickly. And the fact is that most marketers miss that little window within the channels, and if you're in 6 months after a channel becomes a viable channel, you probably missed the window and it's not going to work anymore. So you have to kind of change your whole planning. An annual marketing plan to figure out what you're going to do just doesn't make sense when things are emerging and crashing in really short periods of time. And then to exacerbate the problem more is that a lot of times marketers have the responsibility to get people to the front door, and then the rest of the team is worrying about how do you actually drive conversions all the way through the funnel and keep people locked in. And if you have inefficient conversions and problems deeper in the funnel, you're going to have a really hard time being effective externally in acquiring customers, because your allowable customer acquisition cost becomes a lot lower. So a lot of the inspiration that I have for figuring out how to deal with the challenges for scaling a business, I've taken from my own experience, but I've also looked to some of these companies. So despite all of these challenges that are happening with these short shelf lives of channels, you have some of the fastest growing, most valuable businesses in the world that have emerged in just the last 5 or 10 years. And so what is it that these guys are doing differently than everyone else to get to this point of building so much value so quickly? So one of the things that they're doing is that they've introduced this concept of growth teams. And what you really have, just about every fast-growing company in Silicon Valley today has a growth team. And we'll talk about what a growth team actually does in a minute. And so I've gone out and met with a lot of these teams over the last few years and compared notes on what was working for me. And that's one of the things that's really great about Silicon Valley that I see in Sydney, and hopefully across Australia, and it can get better, is that you got to collaborate, you got to talk with other people, you got to share what's working and learn what's working. And so there's this great open culture among marketers in Silicon Valley, and so I've been able to go and spend time and understand how they're organizing their teams and the processes that they're using, and it's pretty interesting. So I'll be sharing a lot of that today. So one of the big takeaways is that, and it's kind of obvious when you think about it, but surprising that people don't really adjust to this reality too much, which is that growth is holistic. So everyone across the company affects growth, not just the marketing team, yet the marketing team is really the only one who tends to be real metrics oriented in trying to quantify their impact on growth. But the truth is that whether the product team knows it or not, everything they do is touching an important growth lever like engagement and retention and even revenue. Each of those, and the customer support team is affecting things, and the business development and sales team, and really all of those touches together equal what your growth rate ends up becoming. So you need to be good at coordinating that. And that's one of the things that the growth teams have done is actually they often sit inside a product organization instead of the marketing team. And as a result, they have access to the development resources. They have access to some of those deeper levers, but they have to coordinate their actions either. In some teams, online marketing is actually sitting in that growth team, and in others, it's a separate team, but it still needs to be super coordinated on what's happening there. So another key finding, and this one's not surprising for anyone who's been doing online marketing, but is that testing drives growth. And if anyone's familiar with the game of Battleship, it's just a great analogy, and one that I borrowed from Brian Balfour, who's the head of growth at HubSpot's Sidekick product. And it's basically the idea that there's kind of two sets of tests. There's tests to discover, and then there's tests to optimize. But the tests to discover are essentially every time you test something, you learn something, even if that test isn't successful. And in the game of Battleship, when you're making a guess at where the other person's battleship is, if you don't hit their battleship, you drop in a white peg. But you learn something, and over time, you have a board that has a lot of white pegs and red pegs, and you start to have a good feeling of where the opportunities are to hit the other person's battleship. So it's the same thing here. And so one example with Qualaroo, I had a test where we actually acquired Qualaroo from Kissmetrics, and it was called Kiss Insights at the time. And part of the acquisition was I was sure that they were doing the freemium model wrong, and that they needed to make a much more valuable free version of the product. And so it's a product that had already gotten 1 billion views across all these other sites. And I figured if we made a really valuable free product, it's going to expand that base and take, if I'm getting 4% of a curve that looks like this, that's not nearly as interesting of a business than if it's growing like this and I'm getting 2%. And so it's about trying to accelerate that adoption and footprint. And we invested a lot in getting the product aligned to that vision, and it totally failed. Which kind of sucked because we actually paid a lot of money for the business only to have it not work out the way we thought. But we learned something. What happened was when we made it free, there was almost no additional demand when we made a really valuable free product, there's almost no additional demand for the product. So what we learned was there's way less price sensitivity than we thought. People either need this or they don't need it. If they don't need it, the price really didn't matter that much to make them need it. So we went the other direction, and we started building integrations, and we added a lot more features, and we had surveys that could have branching and multiple steps, and we 10x'd the price over time as we added each of these things. And all that premium pricing has been a really important part of our growth. So that failed test actually helped us learn something. So that's really, test to discover is pings maybe in new channels. Test to optimize is just the realization that everything you're doing, there's a better way to do it, and you just need to figure it out. But you have to have a baseline, and you try something, and it's constantly trying to improve upon that baseline. This one's kind of counterintuitive, but you actually really need to focus on velocity more than the quality of the test. So a lot of times people spend so much time trying to come up with the perfect test idea, and let's try to hit a baseball analogy. Not sure if that's going to be understandable, but let's try to hit a home run with this test and put a lot into it, and it turns out that you're running 1 or 2 tests a month, and that doesn't move the needle very much in the business because it's really hard to predict what's going to work and what's not going to work. So you have to focus on trying to do a lot of tests, and as you do a lot of tests, you start to learn more and more with each test. And so this is an example of what happened to Twitter when they used to run 2 tests per month. And you can see, growing on a small number is much easier than growing on a big number. But their growth almost stopped in 2010 when they were running only a couple of tests a month. Then a new VP of product came in and pushed for 10 tests a week. And you can see that change in the curve once they were running 10 tests per week. So doing something like that is not easy. That's where you actually need a team that's built around managing that testing. And so when you're thinking about building a growth team, if you don't already have one, the most important role is the person who organizes that team. So it's kind of like agile development, if anyone is familiar with agile development, where you've got a scrum master who's basically organizing the sprints of development. Here you're organizing the testing sprints. You have one person who's got to manage those testing sprints. That's the critical first hire. And over time, if you say I want to run 3 tests per week, and you're having a hard time hitting those 3 tests per week with borrowed resources from other departments, then start to plug in your own people. So you can't get time with the designer, try to get your own designer. But don't go out day one and just assume you're not going to be able to get time with designer, because what's going to happen is that you'll waste months building out a team only to find out that you've got redundancies and you didn't need to go hire all those people. So just start trying to hit a goal and plug people in as needed to hit that goal. So these are some of the roles: growth engineer, designer, analyst. Those are some of the kind of the typical roles that sit within a growth team. And then this team is really designed to execute a high-tempo testing process. So this multiple tests per week. And if they're not doing it, they're not doing well. Part of being able to hit a high tempo is to have a process that's a repeatable, systematic process for doing it. And it looks something like this. So, in your business, the process may be a little bit different. So it's not about there's a one-size-fits-all formula. But this formula has worked well for my business, and it seems to mirror a lot of what other successful growth teams are doing. And it starts with just unbridled ideation. A whole bunch of ideas. One of the things that I found when I was running growth and marketing in various companies is that I had a lot of pressure to always come up with the ideas of things to test. And that was when, if you figured out something that worked, usually it worked for a year or two. Today, it might only work for a couple of months. And so there's this constant pressure to come up with new testing ideas. But if they don't work very long, it's really too much for one person to do. So you need to have a lot of people participating in generating a big backlog of ideas. Then you have to have a good process for prioritizing which ideas you're going to run each week. So it's just this relentless prioritization and trying to figure out what is the very best ideas that I can run from among the ones that we have on our list. And then launch tests. So when I talk about running 3 tests per week, it's not necessarily saying that they have to start and stop in that week, but it's about constantly launching 3 tests. Sometimes you're going to have to run them for a month. Sometimes you can run them for a week, depending on your traffic. But you want to keep getting that learning from running those tests, and then you need to capture the learning. So I'll go into the details of each of these. So for unbridled ideation, as I mentioned, my team, we've opened the door to where I think maybe I have 100 ideas of the 500 in our backlog, and including the ones that we've pushed through the system, which would probably take it up to 750, 800 ideas. We're not reliant on me coming up with the ideas. And the truth is, I actually have a slightly higher hit rate on my ideas. They tend to work a little bit better than everyone else, but like 5% higher or 10% higher than some of the other people. So it's not, there's no reason for me to be the person that comes up with all the best ideas. And then inviting participation from the whole company. So someone who's working in support is going to be really familiar with challenges people have getting started with a product. Somebody working in sales is going to be familiar with how people's decision sort of before they get into your funnel might look like. How are they even considering a product like yours, depending if you're a consumer product or a B2B product. So basically, each of the groups, I've actually had in our engineering team some ideas that we would never have been able to come up with if you didn't have like a deep understanding of how some of the newest emerging technology works. So everybody can offer some pretty unique ideas into the system. So it's not just internal, but also external. There's a good chance that you don't have anyone on your team that knows how to effectively use YouTube, like Nick was talking about, or how to effectively use Pinterest or Instagram, but there might be good opportunities in your business in those channels. So you want to make sure that you're seeking the content that talks about that and seeking the experts and trying to learn from them and bring them into the ideation process with you as well. And then ultimately, all these ideas are just noise if you don't organize them in a consistent way. So one of the things you see across all the leading growth teams is that they all have this concept of the experiment doc, where they're actually pretty scientific about it, and they've got a hypothesis saying exactly what metric they think they can move and how much they think they can move that metric by and why they think that idea is going to move that metric, and any research that supports their guesses around what's going to work, and where in the funnel is it focused, and even tagging up, is it Twitter focused, is there different channels? The more information you can layer on that, the better. And then we use something we call ICE for our scoring, but some people use Pi. It's just some way of being able to compare ideas. So for us, ICE is about impact, confidence, and ease. So impact is, if this works, is this a game changer? Is this something that's going to work really well in my business? Or is it something that's just going to move the needle a little bit, but we're really confident it's going to work and it's super easy to do, so why wouldn't you do it? But so impact, kind of with scale of 1 to 10, 10 being really high impact. Confidence is, do I have a lot of evidence that my existing users are saying that they spend a lot of time in this channel, so we should be experimenting in that channel, or it's a best practice you see across a bunch of other companies. Any of those things can help you to increase your confidence score. And then ease, is it something that, I'll show you an experiment that we ran that we got a 700% increase in email signups, and it took like 5 minutes to implement that experiment. Super easy to implement it, so sometimes ease is really important. I mean, I've had other things that have taken 3 or 4 days to implement, and they didn't work. So ease is an important thing to consider when you're deciding which experiments to run. And so once you've organized all the information around an idea this way, it becomes easier to start to prioritize the backlog. And so for prioritization, so you can do this in Excel. Some of the screenshots I'm showing are actually of a product that we have in private beta called Canvas, but you can easily do it in Excel, you can do it in Trello. It doesn't have to be this product, but in this case, so once you've scored them on ICE, you can actually sort then by really, if you haven't had a win in a while, sort by really high impact stuff so that you've got people on the team are more likely to buy into the process if you're getting lots of wins. If you are really tight on resources, find the really easy experiments to run just so you can hit your tempo goal. Or if you want to take a big swing and go for something really big, then sort on impact. But we're often just trying to balance across a number of different criteria as we're figuring out what to do. But we do it through weekly team nominations. So for the growth team, basically, each person is using these types of criteria, and we usually have a focus area as well. And so we're using these scores and the focus area, and each person's then nominating a couple of tests. So we nominate the tests, and then we have a weekly growth meeting that I'll go into in a minute, where we're actually looking at each person has 30 seconds to pitch their idea to the team. And it's often not their own idea. It's an idea that they've picked from someone else. And in fact, we have a rule on our team that if you're nominating 2 ideas, only one can be your own idea. So one of them has to be somebody else's idea. And so that's where you do a quick 30-second pitch. And then as a team, we're essentially saying if we like it or not, and then we narrow down. And so in a pretty short period of time, we're able to say, okay, these are the 3 or 4 or 5 tests we're going to try to launch this week. And so launching the test then is what we do in that meeting, where we actually then choose the tests. As I said, the challenge in this meeting is that it's really easy for creative people to go down a brainstorming rat hole. And so I'm going to show you an agenda on the next slide that we really work hard to stay within that agenda so that we don't end up going down a brainstorming rat hole. But each of the ideas has a project manager who's assigned to it, so that if that idea doesn't get launched, now everyone has someone that they can go to and actually, or at least the growth growth master or product manager of growth has someone they can go to and say, hey, why didn't that launch, or where are we with this? So somebody has ownership. Doesn't mean that they're doing the whole thing. They're coordinating a designer maybe, they're coordinating some other people, but they're the go-to person for that. And then the PM of growth, or the growth master, is actually then assisting to help them get that test out. And then the last step is capturing the learning from the tests. So you want to make sure that it's really easy. Imagine looking back at that Twitter, if they're running 10 tests per week. So HubSpot, I know someone's going to be speaking from HubSpot later today, their growth team on Sidekick runs 30 experiments per week. So if you haven't documented really well what you're doing, what worked, why it worked, if it didn't work, why you'd think it didn't work, there's a good chance that you're going to be repeating the same tests over and over again, or a new person gets added onto the team and they're not going to enter in any kinds of ideas because they just don't know what's there. So you want to make sure that you make it really easy to access any of the information around what's already been tested, what worked, what didn't work, because that's the whole process is really being done to maximize learning. So that weekly meeting that I mentioned, so basically the benefit of doing it every week is that it establishes this growth rhythm where each day for my team, we know at Tuesday at 11 a.m., we're getting together and we're going to go through the tests that we were supposed to launch last week, and if we actually launched them, what learning we got, look at our KPIs. We're really, everyone on the team knows that that's the day we hold ourselves accountable for what we did over the last week. And it's in this meeting that we're continuously improving the process. So that's why I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all process. In your organization, it might be a little bit different, and you might need to figure out something that fits better for your organization, but you want to constantly be tweaking things and figuring out, if we're not getting our tests out, is it because it's not a priority, or do we not have that skill set within the company, or is that person just so overwhelmed? Whatever it might be, you want to try to understand those things and keep making the adjustments so that you can hit your testing targets and really maximize the learning that you're getting through running the tests. In our meeting, it's not just the core growth team, but we actually do include the CTO, the vice president of product, myself. The benefit of including all of us, first of all, it's 1 hour a week, and if the CEO doesn't think a growth meeting is important enough to spend 1 hour a week, then that's probably a little bit of a bad sign for your organization, because the CEO is ultimately, the most important thing most CEOs can do is deliver growth to their investors. And so important for a CEO to participate. The vice president of product, it's important because if they're not part of that decision of what tests get run, there's a good chance that they're going to say, oh, well, that conflicts with the experience that we're trying to deliver. We can't do that one. They're going to overrule things. But having them be a voice in those meetings can be really important. CTO, so that there's going to be a lot of technology decisions associated with it, so it's important to have each of those people. But again, that starts to become an expensive meeting, and that's why you want to make sure you don't go down the rat hole of a meeting that goes for 3 hours because you get in a creative brainstorming session. And so this is an example of the agenda that we use in our meeting, where literally our product manager of growth will tell me, hey, we're through the KPI section. Yeah, I just want to give you a heads up. If you want to keep talking, you can. But we're going to probably go over on this meeting then. And so through that gentle nudging, we're able to stay on schedule, and she is able to end it at a time, and all it takes is a couple meetings going way over for other people to say, I don't have time for that meeting. So this is how we organize our growth meetings. So I'll take you through a few examples. I mentioned this is an example of a test that, so for growth hackers, one of the important things we have is an email that we send out each week that's the top growth stories of that week. And the day we send that out tends to be our biggest day of the week. We do it early in the week, and it pulls momentum through the site for the whole week of driving interaction and engagement on the site. And so our weekly growth letter is really important for our growth. So being able to grow the list of people who are subscribing to it is important. And all we did on this test was we moved that collector for the, get the top growth stories to your inbox each week. We moved it from the bottom of the page to the top of the page. Super easy Optimizely test, but you can see it increased our monthly email collection by 700%. And we did a whole bunch of tests off the back end of this, but one of the tests, like we call double down tests. So the best indication of something that's going to work is based on learning that you got from something else. So for example, our top idea contributor is actually our analyst, because he's the first guy who sees what's working and what's not working, and he's living in the data, and he's constantly adding new tests as he's processing that information. So one of the double down tests that we did then is, once we have their email, it doesn't mean that they can participate on the site. They can't vote necessarily, they can't comment, they can't do anything that adds value to the site, but they're halfway to an actual registration. And so that was our double down test, was just to give them this message that just says, you're one step away from the full Growth Hackers experience. And being able to give that message to them boosted our weekly signups by another 22% in terms of people who actually could sign up and participate in the community. So that was an important double down test. But we had a bunch of winning tests that came off of the back of that first one. And what you can see is that we actually didn't start this growth process until January, about 10 months ago. And part of it was that even though I've been a head of marketing for a lot of companies and growth for a lot of companies, CEO role is really different. And so I was pulled into fundraising and product development and HR issues and all kinds of other stuff. And so I had to rely on a team to do these things. And the only thing I could really do was keep telling them, hey, we need to do more testing. We need to do more testing. And they took it as, oh yeah, we better get another one out this month. And by not putting a quantitative goal around the testing, they weren't doing that much. But the minute that I said, I don't care what test we do, I don't care how big it is, how small it is, we need to do 3 tests per week. That's my only goal I put out to them. And as soon as I held them to that 3 per week, we turned the corner, and everything else, all of the process and management of the tests and everything else was a function of trying to hit that 3 per week. But it's the 3 per week that ultimately delivers the results. And again, as I said, the Sidekick team does 30 per week. The Twitter team does 10 per week. So holding yourself accountable to a number of tests per week can be a huge driver on being able to hit your growth objectives. And then this is just an example of, you can find inspiration anywhere. If you just look at Dropbox, for example, if you pull down from the menu bar, if you use Dropbox, you'll see a number of things that they've tested and optimized. So there's an upgrade button right there, and the color of that, the how bold that is, what else could go in place of that upgrade button? Is it just upgrade, or is it upgrade to get more space? Like what's the benefit that they tie there? So a bunch of tests there. Then they also know the other reason people upgrade is they run out of space. So they've got a whole promotion around, here's why you don't lose your pictures. Add your pictures into Dropbox. And they know that if they can push people to add their pictures, they're more likely to hit the limit and then upgrade. And then finally, each time you save a file, it shows you the 5 most recent files. If you hover over that, there's a share link right there. If you click on that, somebody else then is going to see a Dropbox promotion when they go to retrieve that file. And so this is just one place where you can see 3 different growth drivers in there. And as you start to just look at different sites, you'll realize that there's a lot of in-product growth opportunities that you can get inspired. So some of the best ideas that I've run were things that I saw on other sites and kind of tied them together and ultimately led to big breakthroughs. So at the end of the day, I get a lot of people essentially say, hey, give me a growth hack. And I don't have a growth hack, but what I do have is that I can give ideas. My ideas are probably not as good as somebody else's ideas who's closer to your business, who knows your customers, who knows your product, who knows where your customers spend time. And so by understanding those things, you'll get the ideas, and then you need a process and a team to actually manage and execute those ideas and prioritize those ideas. And it's through that team and through that process that you actually get the silver bullet that leads to growth. And so it's not any one individual idea, it's actually a process that helps you identify a bunch of ideas and figure out which ones are going to ultimately yield the results. So that's it. So thanks, everyone.